A black woman walks into a courtroom for a routine matter, only to face immediate dismissal and disrespect from the judge. But when she calmly reaches for her credentials, the entire courtroom atmosphere shifts. What she reveals next will leave everyone speechless. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 305, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. Judge Harold Montgomery adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the case file before him, his weathered face impassive beneath a crown of silver hair. 30 years on the bench had taught him to maintain a careful neutrality, though colleagues whispered that his rulings had grown increasingly conservative with age. Today's docket included what appeared to be a straightforward contract dispute. Straightforward, that is, until Imani Washington had stepped into his courtroom. She sat at the plaintiff's table alone, her spine straight as a rod, dark hands clasped firmly atop a manila folder. Unlike the corporate attorneys who typically appeared before him in tailored suits worth more than some people's monthly salary, Ms. Washington wore a simple navy blazer over a cream blouse. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her expression composed, despite being the only black person in the room besides the elderly bailiff. Across the aisle, the defense table overflowed with legal muscle. 3 white men in expensive suits flanked their client, Martin Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Development Group. Reynolds was a courthouse regular, his company frequently embroiled in litigation but rarely facing consequences. The lead attorney, William Prescott, was engaged in a whispered conversation with his client, both men occasionally glancing toward Ms. Washington with barely concealed disdain. Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. "We're here for case number 2023 CV 4872, Washington versus Reynolds Development Group. Ms. Washington is representing herself, I see." He peered at her over his glasses, his tone carrying a hint of disapproval. "And Mr. Reynolds is represented by Mr. Prescott and Associates. Let's proceed." Imani Washington rose, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Thank you, Your Honor. As outlined in my complaint, Reynolds Development Group was contracted to renovate my grandmother's historical home in Riverside. The contract specifically required preservation of original architectural elements, including the hand-carved staircase dating back to 1923. She withdrew several photographs from her folder, approaching the bench to submit them as evidence. Instead, as these images show, they demolished these irreplaceable features without consultation, significantly diminishing the home's historical value and violating our written agreement. Judge Montgomery examined the photos with a cursory glance before setting them aside. "Continue." "The contract included a clause requiring objection, Your Honor." William Prescott stood, buttoning his jacket with a practiced flourish. "Ms. Washington, while clearly passionate, lacks legal training to properly interpret contractual language. Our client operated within the bounds of the agreement, which provided necessary latitude for construction decisions." The judge nodded. "Sustained. Ms. Washington, without legal credentials, interpretations of contract law can be challenging." Imani's expression remained unchanged, though something flickered in her dark eyes. "With respect, Your Honor, the contract explicitly states—" "The contract," Prescott interrupted, "included standard provisions allowing for professional discretion when structural issues arise. My client discovered extensive termite damage necessitating removal of the staircase. This decision was made for safety reasons." Judge Montgomery turned to Imani. "Did the contract address unforeseen structural problems?" "It did, Your Honor, but it required consultation before any historical elements were removed. They never consulted us. Furthermore, our independent inspection found no evidence of termite damage. They've provided no documentation to support their claim." Prescott smiled thinly. "Your Honor, Mr. Reynolds has been in this business for 25 years. His professional assessment is not evidence, Imani interjected firmly. The burden of proof lies with the defendant to demonstrate the necessity of their deviation from explicit contractual terms. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly at her use of legal terminology. Ms. Washington, while I appreciate your preparation, this court must rely on established legal expertise. He glanced at Prescott. Does your client have documentation regarding the alleged termite damage? We can certainly provide that at a later date, Your Honor. Imani opened her mouth to object, but Judge Montgomery continued. Very well. What remedy are you seeking, Ms. Washington? The contract includes a penalty clause of $175,000 for unauthorized alterations to historical elements. Additionally, I'm seeking compensation for diminished property value, estimated at $230,000 by a historical preservation specialist. Reynolds leaned forward, whispering something to Prescott, who nodded before addressing the court. Your Honor, this is precisely the type of exaggerated claim we anticipated. Ms. Washington is clearly seeking a windfall from my client's reputable business. Judge Montgomery's expression hardened. Ms. Washington, these are substantial claims. Do you have evidence supporting your valuation? Yes, Your Honor. She extracted another document from her folder. I have a detailed appraisal from... Your Honor, Prescott interrupted again. We would question the methodology of any appraisal obtained by the plaintiff. These historical valuations are notoriously subjective. The judge nodded. I tend to agree, Mr. Prescott. Imani took a deep breath. Your Honor, if I may complete a sentence without interruption, I believe my evidence will satisfy the court's concerns. Watch your tone, Ms. Washington, Judge Montgomery warned. This court will decide what evidence is satisfactory. Something shifted in Imani's demeanor then, a subtle straightening of her shoulders. I apologize, Your Honor. I simply wish to present my case fully, as is my right in this courtroom. Proceed, the judge said curtly. The appraisal was conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Chen, whose credentials include 20 years of historical property assessment. Her methodology follows guidelines established by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Imani presented the document, which the judge accepted with visible reluctance. As he skimmed it, Prescott approached the bench. Your Honor, even if we accept this appraisal, which we don't, my client has already offered a reasonable settlement of $25,000 to resolve this matter. Ms. Washington's refusal demonstrates she's not acting in good faith. Judge Montgomery looked at Imani. Is this true? You've rejected a settlement offer? Yes, Your Honor, because it's grossly inadequate given the documented damages. The contract Mr. Reynolds signed... Ms. Washington, the judge interrupted, removing his glasses. Courts favor reasonable resolution over protracted litigation. Mr. Reynolds is a respected businessman in this community. His offer seems more than generous for what amounts to a renovation disagreement. Imani's expression remained composed, but her voice took on a new edge. With respect, Your Honor, this is not a mere disagreement. It's a clear breach of contract with demonstrable damages. Mr. Reynolds's community standing does not exempt him from contractual obligations. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Montgomery's face flushed slightly. Ms. Washington, I've been practicing law since before you were born. I understand contract disputes. What I'm seeing is a property owner dissatisfied with renovation work seeking an excessive payout. What you're seeing, Your Honor, Imani replied evenly, is a pattern I've observed frequently in this courthouse. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Prescott and his associates exchanged glances. Judge Montgomery leaned forward. Elaborate, Ms. Washington. I've observed that certain plaintiffs receive different treatment in this court than others. Certain defendants, particularly those with community connections, seem to enjoy presumptions of credibility not extended to all parties. The judge's knuckles whitened around his gavel. Ms. Washington, you are dangerously close to contempt. If you're implying what I think you're implying, I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. I'm directly stating that the court has repeatedly interrupted my presentation, accepted defense assertions without evidence, and dismissed my documented claims despite their legal merit. I'm questioning whether this treatment would be the same if I were represented by a large firm or if I were not a black woman appearing pro se. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Reynolds leaned back in his chair with a smirk, clearly believing Imani had just destroyed her case. Judge Montgomery's face darkened. Ms. Washington, you will retract that statement immediately or face contempt charges. Imani remained standing, unintimidated. I cannot retract an observation of fact, Your Honor. However, before you make your ruling on contempt, you should know that while I am representing myself today, I am not without legal expertise. She reached into her blazer pocket and removed a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a credential. I'm Assistant United States Attorney Imani Washington, Northern District. I'm here today in my personal capacity, but I've been taking careful notes on the procedural irregularities in this hearing, including the court's disparate treatment of the parties. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Reynolds's smirk vanished. Prescott stiffened visibly. Judge Montgomery stared at the credential, the color draining from his face. For several seconds, the only sound in courtroom 305 was the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Judge Montgomery's hand, which had been poised to bang his gavel, remained frozen in midair. William Prescott's mouth opened and closed without producing words, his usual eloquence deserting him. In the gallery, a court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers suspended above her stenotype machine. Imani Washington stood perfectly still, credential still visible in her hand, waiting. Judge Montgomery finally found his voice. Ms. Washington, Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington, you deliberately concealed your position from this court. His tone attempted authority but wobbled with uncertainty. Not at all, Your Honor, Imani replied calmly. My filing clearly stated my occupation. I appeared today as a private citizen with a legitimate civil complaint, which I have every right to do. I simply chose not to emphasize my professional role, as it has no bearing on the merits of my case. She returned the credential to her pocket. However, it does bear on how proceedings in this courtroom are conducted. Reynolds leaned forward, whispering urgently to Prescott, whose professional composure was rapidly reassembling itself. Your Honor, the attorney interjected, Ms. Washington's occupation doesn't change the facts of this case. My client stands by his position. Naturally, Imani said, turning slightly toward the defense table. Just as I stand by mine, Mr. Prescott. The difference is that I have supporting evidence for every claim I've made today, while your client has offered only assertions and promises of future documentation. Judge Montgomery cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense courtroom. Let's all take a moment here. He placed his gavel down carefully, as if it might detonate. Ms. Washington, while your professional background is noteworthy, it doesn't grant your claims special weight in this proceeding. I couldn't agree more, Your Honor, Imani replied smoothly. Each claim should be evaluated solely on its legal merits and supporting evidence. That's precisely my point. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Nevertheless, your insinuation about this court's impartiality is both inappropriate and unfounded. With respect, Your Honor, I've made no insinuations. I've stated observable facts about today's proceedings. Imani gestured to her legal pad, where she had been taking detailed notes. Since this hearing began, you've sustained all 4 of Mr. Prescott's objections without allowing me to complete my responses. You've permitted Mr. Prescott to interrupt my presentation 7 times. You've accepted Mr. Reynolds' claim of termite damage without requiring evidence, while questioning the validity of my professional appraisal despite its adherence to industry standards. A flush crept up Judge Montgomery's neck as Imani continued, her voice measured and precise. These are not insinuations, Your Honor. They are documented procedural irregularities that would concern any officer of the court, regardless of their role or background. William Prescott, sensing the shifting dynamics, rose to his feet. Your Honor, while Ms. Washington's observations are interesting, they don't address the substance of this dispute. Perhaps we could suggest a brief recess to allow all parties to regroup. Judge Montgomery seized the suggestion like a lifeline. Yes, a recess would be appropriate. This court will take 15 minutes. He banged his gavel with unnecessary force, then retreated to his chambers with unusual haste. As the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, Reynolds grabbed Prescott's arm, pulling him into an intense huddle with the other attorneys. Their glances toward Imani grew increasingly concerned as they conferred. Imani remained at the plaintiff's table, calmly organizing her documents. The elderly bailiff approached, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. That was something to see, Ms. Washington, he said quietly. Haven't witnessed Judge Montgomery retreat to chambers that fast in my 15 years here. Imani looked up, returning his smile. Sometimes perspective shifts can be abrupt, Mr. Jackson. Robert Jackson. He glanced toward the judge's chambers. Been watching cases in this courtroom a long time. Seen patterns myself. She nodded slightly, understanding the subtext of his comment. Patterns are only meaningful when documented, Mr. Jackson. Yes, ma'am. Some folks been documenting for years. With that cryptic remark, he returned to his post by the door. Exactly 15 minutes later, Judge Montgomery returned to the bench. His demeanor had shifted noticeably, his back straighter, his expression more guarded. He surveyed the courtroom with deliberate care before speaking. Upon reflection, I believe this case warrants more thorough examination than our docket today allows. I'm scheduling a full evidentiary hearing 2 weeks from today, where both parties will present all relevant documentation. He looked directly at the defense table. Mr. Prescott, the court will expect complete evidence regarding the alleged termite damage and any other structural issues that influenced your client's decisions. Prescott nodded stiffly. Of course, Your Honor. Additionally, the judge continued, I'm appointing a court expert to provide an independent assessment of the property's historical value and the impact of the renovations. His eyes shifted to Imani. Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington, while I maintain that your dual role here is unusual, the court acknowledges your right to pursue this civil matter. Thank you, Your Honor, Imani replied. I look forward to a full and fair hearing of the evidence. Something in her tone caused the judge to hesitate before continuing. Before we conclude today, I want to address one matter directly. This court takes any concern about impartiality very seriously. I have served this community for 3 decades with integrity and fairness. The record will reflect your commitment, Your Honor, Imani said, just as it will reflect the proceedings of today and the upcoming evidentiary hearing. Judge Montgomery's eyes narrowed slightly at the implicit reminder that his handling of this case would be scrutinized. This hearing is adjourned until May 15th at 9 a.m. The gavel fell with finality. As the courtroom began to empty, William Prescott approached Imani's table, his expression carefully neutral. Reynolds hovered a few steps behind. His earlier confidence evaporated. Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington, Prescott began, keeping his voice low. My client would like to revisit settlement discussions. Imani gathered her documents unhurriedly. I imagined he might. Perhaps we could start with the original contract penalty of $175,000. Mr. Prescott, your client had an opportunity to honor that penalty when he breached our agreement. That opportunity has passed. She closed her briefcase with a decisive click. My grandmother's house was one of the few historically significant properties in Riverside owned by a black family. The carved staircase your client destroyed was created by James Washington, my great-grandfather, who was denied work by white-owned construction companies and instead poured his craftsmanship into his own home. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably as she continued. That staircase represented more than property value, Mr. Prescott. It represented my family's resilience. So no, $175,000 no longer addresses the damage done. What are you looking for? Reynolds asked directly, speaking for the first time. Full replacement of the staircase by master craftsmen according to the original designs, which my family preserved. Financial compensation of $400,000 for breach of contract, diminished historical value, and the intentional disregard of our agreement. Her gaze was unwavering. And a formal apology. Reynolds' face flushed. That's outrageous. It's accountability, Imani corrected. Something your company has successfully avoided in this courthouse for years. I'd suggest you consider my terms carefully before our next hearing. She lifted her briefcase. Discovery works both ways, Mr. Reynolds. I'm very thorough. As she walked away, Prescott turned to his client. Martin, we need to talk, now. In the courthouse corridor, Robert Jackson was waiting near the water fountain. As Imani passed, he spoke without looking directly at her. Courthouse Records Archive, basement level. Ask for Michelle Coleman. Then he walked away, continuing his rounds. Imani checked her watch. She had an hour before her next appointment. Adjusting course, she headed for the elevator that would take her to the basement of the county courthouse, curious about what the elderly bailiff thought she should see and who Michelle Coleman might be. Behind her, through the partially open door of courtroom 305, she could hear Judge Montgomery engaged in a heated phone conversation, his voice carrying despite his efforts to keep it down. I don't care what it takes, he was saying. I need everything you can find on Assistant U.S. Attorney Imani Washington, and I need it yesterday. Imani smiled slightly as the elevator doors closed. The judge was doing exactly what she had anticipated. The real question was what she would find in the basement archives, and whether it would confirm her suspicions about patterns of judicial conduct that went far beyond her grandmother's staircase. The basement of the county courthouse felt like a different world. Gone were the polished surfaces and dignified atmosphere of the upper floors, replaced by utilitarian concrete and fluorescent lighting that buzzed intermittently. The air carried the unmistakable scent of aged paper and dust, with undertones of the industrial cleaning products used on institutional floors. Imani followed the faded signs toward the records archive, her heels echoing in the empty corridor. Few people ventured to this level unless they had specific business with county records or were seeking the cafeteria tucked away in the eastern wing. Today, the hallway was deserted. The records archive entrance featured a glass door with lettering so worn it was barely legible. Inside, rows of metal shelving stretched into the distance, laden with boxes and bound volumes. A counter separated the public area from the stacks, behind which sat a woman who appeared to be in her mid-60s, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun. She was typing methodically at an outdated computer, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Excuse me," Imani said. "I'm looking for Michelle Coleman." The woman looked up, studying Imani with shrewd eyes that suggested she missed very little. "You've found her." Her gaze traveled over Imani's professional attire, lingering briefly on the briefcase. "How can I help you, counselor?" "Robert Jackson suggested I speak with you." At the mention of the bailiff's name, something shifted in Michelle's expression. A subtle relaxation, coupled with heightened interest. Did he now? She removed her glasses, letting them hang from a beaded chain around her neck. "And you would be?" Assistant U.S. Attorney Imani Washington, though I'm here in a personal capacity. Michelle nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Wait here a moment. She disappeared into the stacks, returning several minutes later with a key in hand. Follow me, Ms. Washington. Instead of leading Imani deeper into the archives, Michelle guided her to a nondescript door marked Storage in a side corridor. The key unlocked it, revealing not a storage closet but a small, well-organized office. Filing cabinets lined one wall, while another displayed decades of courthouse staff photos. A desk occupied the center, bearing a newer computer than the one at the front counter. This is my actual office, Michelle explained, closing the door behind them. The counter is for official business. This is where the real work happens. And what work is that exactly? Imani asked, taking the seat Michelle offered. The older woman settled into her chair with a sigh that spoke of years of service. 37 years I've worked in these archives, Ms. Washington. Started as a filing clerk right out of high school, worked my way up to head archivist. I've seen judges come and go, witnessed the transition from paper to digital, watched how justice is dispensed in this building. Her fingers drummed lightly on the desktop. And I've kept records of my own. Records? Robert wouldn't have sent you here if he didn't think you needed to see them. Michelle studied Imani's face. You had a run-in with Judge Montgomery today, I take it? Imani raised an eyebrow. News travels fast. In a courthouse, always. Michelle opened a drawer in her desk, extracting a flash drive. For 30 years, I've documented patterns in judicial rulings across every court in this building. Statistical analyses, outcome comparisons, demographic breakdowns of plaintiffs and defendants in relation to judgments. She held up the drive. Most of it is just numbers. Publicly available information, compiled differently than the official records. Why? Michelle's expression hardened slightly. My son was 19 when he was sentenced to 15 years for possession of marijuana, an amount that would be legal in most states today. The white college student arrested the same night, with twice the amount, got probation. Same judge, same courthouse, different outcomes. She placed the flash drive on the desk between them. After that, I started paying attention, really paying attention. Imani left the drive untouched. And Judge Montgomery? See for yourself. Michelle turned to her computer, typing briefly before swiveling the monitor toward Imani. These are civil case outcomes in Judge Montgomery's courtroom over the past decade, broken down by plaintiff demographics. The screen displayed a series of graphs and charts, meticulously organized and annotated. Imani leaned forward, her training allowing her to quickly interpret the data. The patterns were unmistakable. Plaintiffs of color prevailed at rates significantly lower than their white counterparts, especially when facing white defendants. When defendants were corporations, the disparity grew even more pronounced. This can't be coincidence, Imani murmured, scrolling through the data. Statistical significance is well beyond the threshold for random distribution, Michelle confirmed. I've had a mathematics professor from the community college verify the methodology anonymously. These patterns exist across multiple judges, but Montgomery, she pointed to a comparison chart. He's an outlier even among his peers. Imani's mind raced through the implications. Have you shared this information before? Michelle's laugh held no humor. With whom? The Judicial Review Board consists of the judge's former colleagues and golf partners. The local press won't touch anything that might jeopardize their courthouse access, and while these numbers tell a story, they don't prove intent. But they establish a pattern that can't be ignored if brought to light properly. Imani continued examining the data. You've created something remarkable here, Ms. Coleman. Michelle, please. The archivist sighed. It would be remarkable if it made a difference. So far, it's just been my private rebellion, documenting what I can't change. Perhaps that's about to change. Imani finally reached for the flash drive. May I? Michelle nodded. That's why Robert sent you. He's been my eyes and ears in the courtroom since he transferred to bailiff duty. We've been waiting for someone with the position and the courage to do something with this information. Imani pocketed the drive. I'll need to review everything carefully. Verify the methodology independently. Of course, I'd expect nothing less from a federal prosecutor. Michelle leaned back in her chair. But that's not all Robert thought you should see. Your case against Reynolds Development isn't the first time they've had issues with historic properties. She retrieved a bound folder from one of the filing cabinets, placing it on the desk. These are sealed records from 3 settlements Reynolds reached with plaintiffs in historic preservation cases, sealed by judicial order, specifically, orders signed by Judge Montgomery. Imani stared at the folder. How do you have access to sealed court records? Michelle's expression remained neutral. Archives receive everything eventually. Sealing orders restrict public access, not archival cataloging. A slight smile touched her lips. And I'm very thorough in my cataloging. Opening the folder carefully, Imani found documentation of 3 separate cases where Reynolds Development had been accused of similar breaches of contract regarding historic properties. In each case, the pattern was identical. Claims of structural issues necessitating removal of historic elements, followed by renovations that increased property values while diminishing historical significance. All 3 cases had been settled with non-disclosure agreements after preliminary hearings before Judge Montgomery. The settlements were substantially larger than what Reynolds initially offered, Michelle noted, but the sealing orders ensured no one knew about the pattern. Until now, Imani said quietly. There's one more thing you should see. Michelle hesitated, then extracted a final document from the folder. Financial disclosure forms for the county judiciary. Public records, but not easily accessible without knowing what you're looking for. Imani scanned the document, stopping at a highlighted entry. Judge Harold Montgomery reported investment income from MTR Partners, a real estate investment group. A separate page from the Secretary of State's business registry showed Martin Reynolds listed as a principal in the same investment group. This creates, at minimum, the appearance of a conflict of interest, Imani said, her prosecutor's mind already framing the issue in legal terms. At minimum, Michelle agreed. At worst, judicial misconduct with potential criminal implications. Imani carefully returned the documents to the folder. I'll need copies of everything. Michelle was already moving toward a copier in the corner. I thought you might. Robert and I have been documenting these connections for years, but we needed someone who could actually do something with the information. As the copier hummed, Imani considered the wider implications. This goes beyond my civil case. Yes, Michelle said simply. The question is, what are you prepared to do about it? Before Imani could answer, her phone vibrated with an incoming text message. It was from an unknown number. Judge M made calls to Reynolds and DA's office after your hearing. Meeting set at Riverside Club, 7 p.m. tonight. Careful what you pursue. Not everyone in the courthouse is corrupt, but those who are protect each other. She showed the message to Michelle, whose expression darkened. That would be from Carmen, Judge Montgomery's clerk. She's part of our little observation network. How extensive is this network of yours? Michelle finished making copies and handed a sealed envelope to Imani. Extensive enough to have documented years of judicial misconduct, but not powerful enough to challenge it. Until now, perhaps. Imani accepted the envelope, her mind already formulating a strategy. What had begun as a personal case over her grandmother's property had unexpectedly opened a door to something much larger, systemic judicial misconduct that might extend far beyond Judge Montgomery. Thank you, Michelle. This information will be treated with the utmost discretion." The archivist nodded. "Just be careful, Ms. Washington. Judge Montgomery has powerful friends, and you've already made yourself a target." As Imani left the archives, envelope and flash drive secured in her briefcase, she knew her next steps would need to be carefully calculated. The stakes had just grown exponentially, and she was no longer fighting just for her grandmother's staircase, but potentially for the integrity of the entire local judicial system. Imani Washington's office at the U.S. Attorney's Northern District headquarters was a stark contrast to the county courthouse's musty archives. Clean lines, modern furnishings, and state-of-the-art technology reflected the federal government's resources. The view from her 12th floor window showcased the city skyline, a constant reminder of the community she served. It was nearly 7 p.m., but the office remained active. 3 of her most trusted colleagues had gathered at her request. Marcus Chen, a former FBI analyst who specialized in financial crimes; Danielle Rodriguez, whose background in civil rights law made her particularly valuable; and Thomas Okafor, a veteran prosecutor with unparalleled knowledge of judicial ethics regulations. "I appreciate you all staying late," Imani said, closing her office door. "What I'm about to share requires absolute discretion." She connected Michelle Coleman's flash drive to her computer, projecting the statistical analyses onto the wall screen. For the next 20 minutes, she methodically explained what she had discovered, including Judge Montgomery's conflict of interest and the pattern of discriminatory rulings. When she finished, silence filled the room. Thomas was the first to speak, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is extensive," he said carefully, "and troubling. But Imani, you understand the implications of pursuing this, especially while your civil case is pending." "I do," she replied. "That's why I need your perspective. I can't ignore this, but I need to proceed correctly." Marcus was studying the financial data with a practiced eye. "The investment connection between Montgomery and Reynolds is circumstantial but concerning. We'd need to establish whether the judge has ruled on other cases involving Reynolds companies and whether those rulings show favorable treatment." According to the archives, at least 3 similar cases with sealed settlements, Imani confirmed. Danielle, who had been silently reviewing the demographic breakdowns of case outcomes, looked up with tightly controlled anger in her eyes. "These statistics are damning. When adjusted for case type and legal representation, the disparities in outcomes based on race are statistically impossible to attribute to chance." Her finger traced a particular graph, particularly in civil suits against corporate entities. Black plaintiffs prevail at 1/8 the rate of white plaintiffs in Montgomery's courtroom when facing corporate defendants. "The question remains," Thomas interjected, "what's our jurisdiction here? Judicial misconduct typically falls to the State Judicial Conduct Commission. Unless it rises to the level of criminal behavior," Imani countered. "If Montgomery is systematically violating civil rights under color of law, accepting benefits for favorable rulings, or obstructing justice through selective application of the law, those fall within federal purview." Marcus nodded slowly. "We'd need more than statistics. Concrete evidence of quid pro quo, explicit bias, or deliberate misconduct. Which is why I want to proceed carefully," Imani said, "starting with my own case." She outlined her strategy. Pursue her civil case against Reynolds aggressively, using discovery to uncover connections between Reynolds and Montgomery, while simultaneously building a broader investigation into the patterns Michelle Coleman had documented. "It's risky," Thomas warned. "Montgomery now knows you're a federal prosecutor. He'll be on guard." "Actually, that works in our favor," Imani replied. "He'll be focusing on me and my case, watching his steps there. He's less likely to suspect a wider investigation into his overall pattern of conduct." Danielle leaned forward. "We should bring in the Bureau. Financial crimes would have jurisdiction over any corruption aspects." "Not yet," Imani cautioned. A formal FBI investigation would alert too many people. For now, we gather evidence informally, build our case privately. If we eventually have enough for formal action, we bring in the Bureau with a fully developed roadmap. Marcus was already taking notes. I'll need copies of those sealed settlements. If there's a pattern of Reynolds destroying historic properties and Montgomery facilitating settlements that benefit both parties while concealing the pattern from the public, that's potentially criminal conspiracy. I'll handle that, Imani assured him. My courthouse contact has access. Thomas still looked concerned. Imani, I have to ask, how personal is this for you? This started with your grandmother's property. The question hung in the air. Imani considered it carefully before responding. It started there, she acknowledged. But what I've uncovered goes far beyond my case. How many plaintiffs have been denied justice in Montgomery's courtroom because of their race? How many corporate defendants like Reynolds have benefited from his bias? This isn't about my grandmother's staircase anymore. It's about integrity in our judicial system. Thomas nodded, satisfied with her answer. Just be careful not to let your personal stake cloud your professional judgment. We need this investigation to be beyond reproach. Agreed, Imani said. Which is why I want all three of you involved. Keep me accountable. They spent the next hour developing a strategic plan. Marcus would analyze the financial connections, creating a web of relationships between Montgomery, Reynolds, and other potential beneficiaries of the judge's favorable rulings. Danielle would review the statistical evidence, ensuring the methodology was sound and the conclusions defensible. Thomas would examine the legal framework for potential federal charges if sufficient evidence emerged. As the meeting concluded, Imani's phone buzzed with another text from Carmen, Judge Montgomery's clerk. Meeting at Riverside Club ended. Judge M. Reynolds, D.A. Barnes present. Your name mentioned repeatedly. They're pulling your case files background. Be prepared. She showed the message to her colleagues. Thomas frowned deeply. If the district attorney is involved, this is escalating quickly. They're forming a united front. Good, Imani said with unexpected calm. Let them coordinate their defense. It makes it more likely they'll make mistakes, create evidence. As her colleagues gathered their materials to leave, Danielle lingered behind. There's something you're not telling us, she said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. Imani hesitated, then retrieved the envelope Michelle had given her from her briefcase. The archive records show that this pattern goes beyond Montgomery. At least 3 other judges show similar disparities in outcomes based on race and corporate status of defendants. Danielle exhaled slowly. You're talking about potentially exposing systemic corruption across the county judiciary. If that's where the evidence leads, yes. Imani's voice was steady. But we start with Montgomery and Reynolds. One case, one judge, one step at a time. After Danielle left, Imani stood at her window, watching the city lights emerge as dusk settled. Her phone rang, her grandmother. Hello, Nana, she answered warmly. Imani, child. How did it go today? Eleanor Washington's voice carried the wisdom of her 83 years. It's complicated, Nana. More complicated than I expected. Your grandfather always said that's how you know you're on the right path. Simple roads rarely lead anywhere worth going. Imani smiled despite her weariness. I found out why they were so determined to remove that staircase. Reynolds has a pattern of targeting historic properties, especially those with cultural significance to Black families. He renovates them to appeal to wealthy buyers, erasing their history in the process. There was a pause before Eleanor responded. This was never just about our house, was it? No, Nana. It's about who gets to preserve their history and who doesn't, whose heritage is valued and whose is disposable. Then you do what needs doing, child. That staircase your great-grandfather built tells our family's story. Every chisel mark, every curve. When they tried to erase that, They tried to erase us. After saying goodbye to her grandmother, Imani returned to her desk. She opened her laptop and began drafting discovery requests for her civil case against Reynolds Development. Detailed, comprehensive requests that would be difficult to evade. She needed to force Reynolds and, by extension, Montgomery into the open. Meanwhile, across town at the exclusive Riverside Club, Martin Reynolds nursed a whiskey in the wood-paneled bar. Judge Montgomery had left an hour earlier, along with District Attorney Barnes, but Reynolds had remained, making calls to his network of business associates and political connections. "I don't care what it costs," he said into his phone, voice low despite the privacy of his corner booth. "I need everything on Assistant U.S. Attorney Imani Washington, every case she's prosecuted, every potential misstep. Find me leverage." He ended the call as William Prescott slid into the booth across from him, looking disturbed. "We have a problem, Martin. A big one." "Washington? We're handling it." "Not just her." Prescott placed a folder on the table. "I've been making inquiries about those statistical analyses you mentioned, the ones Montgomery is worried about. They exist. A court archivist has been compiling case outcome data for years. If those statistics become public," Reynolds drained his whiskey, "then we make sure they don't." His voice hardened. "Find out who this archivist is. Everyone has pressure points, Bill. Everyone." "This is escalating beyond a simple contract dispute," Prescott cautioned. "Federal prosecutors, potential investigations into judicial conduct. We need to consider cutting our losses." Reynolds leaned forward, his expression suddenly cold. "Do you have any idea what's at stake here? It's not just this Washington woman and her grandmother's house. If they start pulling at these threads, everything we've built could unravel. Everything." Prescott studied his client with new understanding. "How many historic properties, Martin? How many judges?" Reynolds signaled for another drink before answering. "Enough that retreat is not an option. Find me something on Washington, something we can use." As the waiter delivered his fresh whiskey, Reynolds stared into the amber liquid, considering his next move in a game that had suddenly become far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The following week unfolded like a chess match. Imani filed her discovery requests in the civil case, detailed, precise demands for documentation that would be difficult for Reynolds Development to dodge. William Prescott responded with predictable objections, claiming the requests were overly broad and burdensome. Judge Montgomery scheduled a hearing to resolve the discovery disputes, set for Friday morning. Meanwhile, Michelle Coleman continued her quiet work in the courthouse archives, now with renewed purpose. Each day, she discreetly compiled additional records that might prove relevant to Imani's investigation, storing them on an encrypted drive Thomas Okafor had provided. The courthouse network of observers, the bailiff Robert Jackson, clerk Carmen Martinez, and several others who had witnessed the systemic problems firsthand, remained vigilant, reporting any unusual activities among the judges or the district attorney's office. On Wednesday morning, Imani received an unexpected visitor at her federal office. The receptionist's voice came through the intercom. "There's a Ms. Eleanor Washington here to see you. She says she's your grandmother." Imani hurried to the reception area, surprised and concerned. "Nana, is everything all right? You should have called first." Eleanor Washington stood tall despite her years, elegant in a tailored navy dress and pearls, her silver hair styled in a dignified crown. She carried a large leather portfolio that appeared heavy for her slender frame. "Some things are better discussed in person," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the gentle but unmistakable authority that had guided 3 generations of Washingtons. "And I believe I have something you need to see." Once settled in Imani's office, Eleanor carefully opened the portfolio and removed several aging documents, spreading them across the desk. "After our conversation, I went through your grandfather's papers in the attic," she explained. Henry kept records of everything, you know, including correspondence about other historic homes in Riverside. Imani examined the yellowed letters and newspaper clippings with growing interest. Nana, these are about properties that Reynolds Development renovated years ago. Not just renovated, Eleanor corrected, stripped of their history. Your grandfather was part of the Riverside Historical Society. When developers started buying historic homes in the neighborhood in the 1990s, he documented the changes. Look at this one. She pointed to a letter addressed to the Historical Society from a homeowner named James Booker, dated 1998. The man described how a development company had contracted to renovate his family's historic Victorian home while preserving key architectural elements. Instead, they had removed the original features, claiming structural damage made preservation impossible. The company wasn't called Reynolds Development then, Eleanor explained. It was Riverside Restoration Group, but look at the signature on their letterhead. Imani studied the document closely. The president of Riverside Restoration Group was listed as Martin Reynolds. They've been doing this for decades, Imani murmured, targeting historically significant properties, particularly those owned by black families, and stripping them of their cultural heritage. Eleanor nodded solemnly. They started in the east side of Riverside, where most black families owned homes. By the time anyone realized the pattern, half the neighborhood's historic character was gone, replaced with modern amenities that appealed to wealthy buyers who wanted the cachet of a historic address without the original architecture. What happened with the Booker house? They fought it in court, just like we're doing. Eleanor's expression darkened. They lost. The judge ruled that the structural damage justified the changes. That judge was Harold Montgomery, in his early years on the bench. Imani's pulse quickened. Nana, this is crucial evidence of a long-standing pattern. May I keep these documents? That's why I brought them. Eleanor gathered the papers carefully. There's something else you should know. After your hearing, I received a phone call from Martin Reynolds himself. Imani stiffened. What? When? Yesterday afternoon. Very polite, very concerned. Said there had been a misunderstanding about our renovation. Offered to double his settlement offer if we could resolve things amicably without unnecessary complications. He's getting worried, Imani said, her voice tight. Did he threaten you? Not in words, Eleanor replied calmly. But he mentioned how sad it would be if the Historical Society were to change its mind about the house's landmark status due to updated structural assessments. The implication was clear enough. That's intimidation of a witness, Nana. We should proceed exactly as we are, Eleanor interrupted firmly. I've lived in this city for 8 decades, child. I've seen men like Reynolds come and go. They flourish because people fear them. I do not. Before Imani could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen. Need to talk. Found financial connections. It's bigger than we thought. Across town, Martin Reynolds paced the conference room of his downtown office while William Prescott and a third man watched silently. The wall displayed photographs of Imani Washington, news articles about her most prominent cases, and a web of her professional connections. Nothing? Reynolds demanded, glaring at the third man. A federal prosecutor must have enemies, made mistakes. Find something we can use. The man, Joseph Miller, a private investigator known for his thorough, if not always ethical methods, shrugged apologetically. She's clean, Mr. Reynolds. Exemplary record at the U.S. Attorney's Office. No financial irregularities, no personal scandals. Respected by colleagues, feared by defendants. Even her law school record is impeccable. Reynolds slammed his fist on the conference table. Everyone has weaknesses. What about family? Friends? Romantic entanglements? Lives alone. Dates occasionally, but nothing serious currently. Parents deceased. Main family connection is her grandmother, Eleanor Washington. Miller hesitated. I should mention that my inquiries haven't gone unnoticed. Someone in the federal building is monitoring database searches on Washington. They know someone's looking into her background. Wonderful, Prescott muttered. So now they're watching us watch them. Reynolds dismissed this concern with a wave. What about this court archivist, Coleman? Miller's expression shifted subtly. Michelle Coleman, 37 years at the courthouse. Widowed, one son currently incarcerated at Eastern State Correctional. Lives alone, keeps to herself mostly. Her son, Reynolds said, latching onto this detail. That's leverage. Prescott looked uncomfortable. Martin, threatening a prisoner's family to influence an investigation would be... Who said anything about threats? Reynolds interrupted smoothly. I'm simply noting that a mother worried about her son's welfare might make different choices than one who isn't. What's the son in for, Miller? Marijuana possession, 15 years, serving year 12. Reynolds smiled thinly. Interesting. The current DA has been supporting early release programs for nonviolent drug offenders. Perhaps Ms. Coleman's son could benefit from such progressive policies if his mother were to reconsider sharing certain statistical analyses with federal prosecutors. Prescott shifted uneasily. This is dangerous territory, Martin. So is a federal investigation into our business practices and judicial relationships, Reynolds snapped. Contact DA Barnes. Arrange a meeting about potential early release candidates. Focus on nonviolent drug offenders with exemplary prison records. As Miller left to make the arrangements, Prescott remained troubled. What about Judge Montgomery? He's growing increasingly anxious about this situation. Montgomery will do exactly as he's told, Reynolds replied coldly. He has too much to lose otherwise. His financial ties to our projects go far beyond that investment group in his disclosure forms. If Washington gets access to those records, she won't, Reynolds interrupted. Judge Montgomery will deny her discovery requests on Friday, claiming they're overly broad. That will buy us time to manage the other aspects of this situation. Meanwhile, in Imani's office, Marcus Chen was explaining what he had discovered in the financial records. It's not just one investment group, he said, pointing to a complex diagram on his laptop. Reynolds has created a web of LLCs and investment partnerships. Montgomery has interests in at least 3 of them, all carefully structured to obscure the connections. But here's the key finding. He highlighted a section of the diagram. 4 other judges in the county court system appear in these networks. Imani studied the names, recognizing all of them from Michelle Coleman's statistical analyses. The same judges showing disparate outcomes based on race and corporate status. Exactly, Marcus confirmed, and it gets worse. Each judge tends to hear cases involving different Reynolds subsidiaries, so the connection isn't immediately obvious unless you map the entire corporate structure. Clever, Imani murmured. Spread the cases across multiple judges, all with financial ties to Reynolds, but disguised through different corporate entities. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. Reynolds Development has secured over $50 million in county contracts over the past decade. Guess who sits on the county contract review board? Montgomery, Imani guessed, along with 2 of the other judges in the financial network. They've been steering public contracts to Reynolds while ruling in his favor in private litigation. Imani leaned back, absorbing the implications. This isn't just judicial misconduct. It's potentially criminal corruption on a massive scale. Marcus nodded solemnly. Which means our approach needs to change. This is too big for an informal investigation. We need to bring in the FBI officially, secure subpoenas for banking records, communications. Before Imani could respond, her phone rang. Carmen Martinez, Judge Montgomery's clerk. Ms. Washington, she said without preamble, her voice tense. You need to know that someone accessed Michelle Coleman's workstation today. Her files were searched. and she just received a call from the district attorney's office about her son's case being reviewed for potential early release. Imani's blood ran cold. They're trying to neutralize our witnesses. Is Michelle safe? For now. But there's something else. Judge Montgomery has rescheduled your discovery hearing. It's no longer on Friday. It's tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. The accelerated timeline could only mean one thing. Reynolds and Montgomery were moving quickly to shut down her investigation before it gained momentum. Thank you, Carmen. Tell Michelle not to respond to anything about her son until she speaks with me. As she ended the call, Imani made a decision. This was escalating too rapidly for caution. She dialed FBI Special Agent Diana Reyes, her longtime contact at the Bureau. Diana, I need to see you immediately. I have evidence of judicial corruption that requires immediate federal intervention. The chess match had suddenly accelerated, with every player making bolder moves. Tomorrow's hearing would be crucial, not just for her grandmother's case, but for exposing a corruption network that had operated unchecked for decades. Courtroom 305 was unusually crowded for a discovery hearing. Word had spread through the courthouse about the confrontation between Judge Montgomery and the federal prosecutor, drawing curious attorneys, clerks, and even a few judges who claimed to have business that required passing by Montgomery's courtroom that morning. The gallery filled quickly, with latecomers standing along the back wall. Imani arrived 30 minutes early, deliberately choosing to prepare at the plaintiff's table rather than outside the courtroom. She arranged her documents methodically, acutely aware of being observed. Judge Montgomery's clerk, Carmen, gave her a subtle nod while delivering files to the bench. He's been in chambers since 7 this morning, Carmen whispered as she passed. 3 calls to Reynolds, 1 to the DA. Imani acknowledged this with an imperceptible nod, continuing her preparations. 10 minutes before the scheduled start, the defense team arrived. Not just William Prescott and his associates, but Martin Reynolds himself, accompanied by a new attorney, Imani recognized as Nathan Goldstein, a former federal prosecutor now specializing in white-collar criminal defense. Their addition of criminal counsel confirmed they understood the stakes had risen. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Montgomery entered, his expression carefully neutral, though Imani noted the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes briefly scanned the crowded gallery before settling on her. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 decades on the bench. "We're here for a discovery dispute in Washington versus Reynolds Development Group. I've reviewed the filings from both parties." He shuffled papers before him. "Ms. Washington, your discovery requests strike me as excessively broad. You've demanded documents going back 20 years regarding properties that have no connection to your grandmother's home." Imani rose, her posture relaxed but commanding. "Your Honor, the documents requested are directly relevant to establishing pattern and practice, which goes to the heart of our case. Reynolds Development has claimed that the removal of historical elements from my grandmother's home was necessary due to structural issues. The requested documents would show whether this is a genuine explanation or a pretext they've employed repeatedly. Pattern and practice is typically relevant in discrimination cases, Ms. Washington, not contract disputes. With respect, Your Honor, when the same justification has been used repeatedly to breach similar contracts, that pattern becomes relevant to questions of good faith and intent." Judge Montgomery frowned slightly. "Mr. Prescott, your response?" The defense attorney stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's requests amount to a fishing expedition. Ms. Washington is attempting to turn a straightforward contract dispute into something much broader. The requests would require thousands of staff hours to compile and review documents from hundreds of unrelated projects." "Those projects are hardly unrelated," Imani countered. "Each involves historic properties, preservation requirements, and claims of structural necessity that justified removing protected elements. The similarities are precisely why these documents are relevant." Montgomery's eyes narrowed. Ms. Washington, this court will not allow you to leverage your position as a federal prosecutor to engage in discovery overreach. I'm not here as a federal prosecutor, Your Honor. I'm here as a plaintiff seeking relevant evidence for my case, as is my right under the rules of civil procedure. Imani's voice remained calm but firm. Furthermore, I find it concerning that my occupation keeps being raised as if it somehow diminishes my rights as a litigant. A murmur ran through the gallery. Montgomery's jaw tightened visibly. Your Honor, Prescott interjected smoothly, perhaps a reasonable compromise would be to limit discovery to projects involving similar historical preservation requirements within the past 5 years. Before the judge could respond, the courtroom doors opened. FBI Special Agent Diana Reyes entered, accompanied by 2 other agents in dark suits. They took seats in the front row of the gallery, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere in the room. Judge Montgomery's gaze flickered toward them, a flash of unease crossing his features. Your Honor, Imani continued, pretending not to notice the new arrivals, the defense's proposed limitation would exclude directly relevant evidence. Reynolds Development has operated under different corporate names over the years, including Riverside Restoration Group in the 1990s. Those earlier projects established the pattern we seek to demonstrate. She removed a document from her folder. I have here a letter from 1998 regarding the renovation of the Booker family home, a historically protected property in Riverside. It details how Riverside Restoration Group, headed by Martin Reynolds, removed original architectural features despite preservation requirements in their contract, claiming structural necessity. The case was litigated in this very courthouse. Judge Montgomery's complexion paled slightly. That case has no bearing. Actually, Your Honor, Imani pressed, the circumstances are remarkably similar to my grandmother's situation. A historic home owned by a black family. A contract explicitly requiring preservation. Removal of protected elements justified by claims of structural damage. Even the legal arguments were identical. She paused meaningfully. As was the outcome. Reynolds leaned forward, whispering urgently to Goldstein, who placed a restraining hand on his arm. In the gallery, Agent Reyes maintained steady eye contact with Imani, a silent confirmation that she was ready to move when needed. Judge Montgomery seemed to be calculating his options, aware of the FBI presence yet unwilling to appear influenced by it. I'll allow discovery going back 10 years, he finally ruled, limited to properties with historical designations similar to the Washington home. Your Honor, Imani responded, Reynolds Development's pattern of conduct extends beyond 10 years, as demonstrated by the Booker case. Artificial time limitations would exclude crucial evidence. The court has ruled, Ms. Washington, 10 years. Imani nodded, having anticipated this restriction. In that case, Your Honor, I'm compelled to issue third-party subpoenas to the County Historical Society, which maintains records of all historically designated properties and renovation disputes. Their archives are not limited by the court's discovery restrictions. A flash of anger crossed Montgomery's face. Ms. Washington, additionally, she continued smoothly, I'll be submitting document requests to the Riverside City Archives regarding building permits and code violations for all Reynolds Development projects, which would include necessary documentation of structural issues they've claimed in previous renovations. The strategy was clear. If Montgomery restricted direct discovery, she would obtain the evidence through alternate channels beyond his control. Prescott rose quickly. Your Honor, these third-party subpoenas represent an end run around the court's discovery limitations. We ask that you prohibit them. The court's authority to limit third-party subpoenas is restricted, Mr. Prescott, as you well know, Imani countered. Unless you're suggesting the court should prevent me from obtaining relevant evidence from public sources. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Montgomery found himself in a procedural corner, He could not legally prevent Imani from seeking public records without making his bias obvious, especially with FBI agents observing the proceedings. The court will not interfere with proper third-party discovery, he finally ruled, his tone clipped. However, any evidence obtained must still meet admissibility standards at trial. Of course, Your Honor, Imani agreed. Now, regarding our request for communications between Reynolds Development and the contractors who allegedly discovered the structural issues in my grandmother's home. Objection, Prescott interrupted. Those communications would be covered by work product privilege. Not when they're directly relevant to the central dispute in the case, Imani countered. The existence and extent of structural damage is the key factual question. If Reynolds instructed contractors to find or even create such damage to justify removing protected elements, those communications are not only discoverable but central to proving our case. Judge Montgomery shifted uncomfortably, aware that his ruling on this issue would be scrutinized. The court will review those communications in camera to determine privilege claims. Thank you, Your Honor, Imani said. We also request any communications between Reynolds Development and the county building inspector who approved the removal of the staircase. This request visibly unsettled both Reynolds and Montgomery. From the gallery, Agent Reyes leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Those communications would be part of the ordinary business process, Prescott objected. Then there should be no issue producing them, Imani replied smoothly. After 2 more hours of detailed arguments over specific discovery requests, Judge Montgomery appeared increasingly cornered. With FBI agents watching and a gallery full of witnesses, his ability to openly favor Reynolds was severely constrained. He ultimately granted the majority of Imani's requests, though with limitations that would require her to fight for each significant document. As the hearing concluded, Nathan Goldstein approached Imani at the plaintiff's table. Assistant U.S. Attorney Washington, he said quietly, my client would like to revisit settlement discussions. That's interesting, Imani replied, gathering her materials. Given Mr. Reynolds's phone call to my grandmother attempting to intimidate her after our last court appearance, I would have thought he preferred more aggressive tactics. Goldstein's expression remained carefully neutral. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. Any settlement discussions should include the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI at this point, Imani replied, nodding toward Agent Reyes, who had now approached them. Given the broader implications that have emerged. What broader implications? Goldstein asked sharply. I think you know exactly what I mean, Counselor. Why else would Martin Reynolds have hired a criminal defense attorney for a simple contract dispute? As Imani walked away with Agent Reyes, she could feel Reynolds' eyes following her. In the corridor outside the courtroom, they found Michelle Coleman waiting, her face tight with worry. They're offering my son early release, she said without preamble. D.A. Barnes called personally this morning. After 12 years, suddenly his case is a priority for review. Imani exchanged glances with Agent Reyes. They're moving faster than anticipated, the FBI agent observed. Which means we need to do the same, Imani replied. Michelle, do you have somewhere safe you can stay? Someone who knows about your work in the archives just tried to leverage your son against you. That suggests they're getting desperate. Michelle's expression hardened with resolve. I've documented corruption in this courthouse for 20 years. I'm not backing down now that someone's finally listening. Good, Agent Reyes said, because we're going to need your testimony for a federal grand jury, as early as next week. The next 48 hours unfolded with the precision and intensity of a coordinated military operation. FBI agents secured and reviewed the statistical evidence Michelle Coleman had compiled, while a separate team began mapping the financial connections Marcus Chen had discovered. U.S. Attorney Karen Phillips, Imani's supervisor, authorized a formal investigation into judicial corruption within the county court system, with Imani and Thomas Okafor as lead prosecutors. Meanwhile, Imani continued pursuing her civil case as both a legitimate claim and a strategic entry point into the broader corruption. She filed her third-party subpoenas to the Historical Society and City Archives immediately after the discovery hearing, knowing that Reynolds would attempt to block them. By Friday evening, the investigation had established a secure command center in a conference room at the Federal Building, walls covered with photographs, timelines, and relationship maps connecting judges, developers, and county officials. Agent Reyes stood before the assembled team, a mix of FBI agents and prosecutors, summarizing their progress. Financial analysis confirms that 5 county judges, including Montgomery, have hidden financial interests in Reynolds's projects. The same judges have consistently ruled in favor of Reynolds' entities in litigation and steered county contracts toward his companies. She indicated a complex diagram on the wall. We've identified over 30 historic properties, predominantly in Black and Latino neighborhoods, where Reynolds used the same playbook: contract for preservation, claim structural issues, remove historic elements, and flip the properties for substantial profit. Thomas Okafor added, "The pattern of case assignments is particularly troubling. Court records show these 5 judges requested or were assigned a disproportionate number of cases involving Reynolds companies, suggesting deliberate case steering." "What about the district attorney?" Karen Phillips asked, reviewing a report. "D.A. Barnes appears to be a facilitator rather than a direct beneficiary," Imani explained. "He's dismissed multiple complaints against Reynolds over the years and declined to investigate allegations of permit fraud. In exchange, Barnes's campaign has received maximum legal contributions from Reynolds and his associates every election cycle." Agent Reyes continued, "We've obtained warrants for electronic communications between all parties. Technical teams will execute those over the weekend. We're also securing warrants for financial records from offshore entities identified in our preliminary investigation." As the briefing concluded, Karen pulled Imani aside. "You've opened Pandora's box here, Washington. The ripple effects could touch state courts, possibly even federal judges who came up through this system." "I know," Imani acknowledged. "That's why I wanted full transparency with you from the start." "You realize they'll come after you personally," Karen warned. "Not just Reynolds and Montgomery, but everyone who benefits from this system. They'll try to discredit you, claim this is a vendetta over your civil case." "Let them try," Imani replied. "Every attack they make gives us another thread to pull." Later that evening, Imani visited her grandmother, bringing case files and takeout dinner. Eleanor Washington's historic home in Riverside, the subject of the original dispute, reflected her refined taste and deep appreciation for heritage. Despite Reynolds's destruction of the staircase, the house retained its dignified character, filled with family photographs spanning generations and artifacts that told the story of Black excellence in the face of historical barriers. "You look tired, child," Eleanor observed as they sat in her cozy kitchen. "This has grown far beyond our staircase, hasn't it?" Imani nodded, picking at her food. "It's a systemic corruption case now, Nana. Reynolds and these judges have been working together for decades, targeting historic properties in minority neighborhoods, erasing cultural heritage for profit, manipulating the courts to avoid consequences." Eleanor considered this, her wise eyes reflecting understanding beyond Imani's explanation. "You know, your grandfather used to say that when you pull on a loose thread, you never know if you'll fix a small hole or unravel the entire garment." She reached across the table, covering Imani's hand with her own. "Are you prepared for how far this might unravel?" "I have to be," Imani replied. "What they've done, it's not just about property or money. It's about who gets to preserve their history and who doesn't, whose heritage is deemed valuable and whose is disposable. Like your great-grandfather's staircase," Eleanor said softly, "each chisel mark telling our family's story." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Imani tensed, immediately alert. "Were you expecting someone, Nana?" Eleanor shook her head, rising slowly. Not at this hour. Let me, Imani said, moving toward the door with caution. She checked the security monitor installed after Reynolds's threatening call and was surprised to see Carmen Martinez, Judge Montgomery's clerk, standing on the porch, repeatedly glancing over her shoulder. Imani opened the door, maintaining a protective stance. Carmen? What are you doing here? I'm sorry to intrude, Carmen said, her voice tight with anxiety. But you need to see this immediately. She thrust a USB drive toward Imani. Montgomery doesn't know I have this. None of them do. Imani ushered her inside, leading her to the kitchen where Eleanor had already set out another cup of tea. What's on the drive? Carmen's hands shook slightly as she accepted the tea. After you left the courthouse yesterday, there was an emergency meeting in Montgomery's chambers. Reynolds, D.A. Barnes, Judge Forrester, Judge Wilson. I was supposed to be gone for the day, but I came back for my phone and overheard them. She took a shaky breath. They were discussing how to handle the Washington problem. Reynolds was pushing for aggressive action. I managed to access Montgomery's computer after hours and found these emails. Imani inserted the drive into her laptop, opening the files while maintaining a cautious expression. The emails revealed explicit coordination between Montgomery and the other implicated judges regarding case assignments, rulings, and strategies to block discovery in cases against Reynolds entities. More disturbing were recent exchanges discussing Imani herself, how to neutralize her investigation, potentially compromise her professionally, or find leverage against her personally. They're planning to file ethics complaints against you, Carmen explained, claiming you're abusing your position as a federal prosecutor to advance a personal civil case. They've also been investigating Michelle Coleman's son, looking for ways to pressure her through his situation. Imani studied Carmen carefully. Why are you showing me this? You're taking an enormous risk. Carmen's expression hardened. My mother lost her home to Reynolds 15 years ago. Historic Victorian in East Riverside, built by her grandfather, who was one of the first black architects in the city. Reynolds claimed water damage made preservation impossible. Judge Forrester ruled against her. A month later, Reynolds sold the renovated property for triple what he paid my mother. Understanding dawned on Imani's face. You've been working at the courthouse all these years. Waiting for a chance to expose them, Carmen finished. Michelle and Robert aren't the only ones who've been watching and documenting. There are more of us than they realize. Eleanor, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Those who destroy heritage never understand that they create guardians in the process. Imani quickly copied the files to her secure work system, then returned the drive to Carmen. These emails are evidence of criminal conspiracy. The FBI needs to see them immediately. But Carmen, this puts you in danger. If they discover you took these files... I've been careful, Carmen assured her, but I should go. The less you know about my methods, the better. She rose to leave, then hesitated. There's something else you should know. They're not just targeting you professionally. Reynolds has hired private investigators to follow you, look into your personal life. They're desperate to find something, anything, they can use against you. After Carmen left, Imani immediately called Agent Reyes to arrange for the new evidence to be properly secured and authenticated. Then she turned to her grandmother, concern evident in her eyes. Nana, you should stay with me for a few days, or with Cousin Michael in the suburbs. Eleanor fixed her with a resolute stare. I have lived in this house for 47 years, child. I buried your grandfather here. I raised your father here. I am not leaving because some corrupt judge and greedy developer are throwing a tantrum. This isn't just a tantrum, Nana. These people have power and resources, and they're feeling cornered. All the more reason for me to stay put, Eleanor insisted. Running would tell them their intimidation works. Besides, she added with a slight smile, You don't think I've survived 8 decades as a black woman in this city without learning how to handle myself, do you? She gestured toward a cabinet near the pantry. Your grandfather's shotgun is still in working order, and unlike these developers, I actually know how to handle structural issues. Despite her concern, Imani couldn't help but smile at her grandmother's indomitable spirit. It was this same resilience that had preserved their family's heritage through generations of challenges. At least let me arrange for security. That I'll accept, Eleanor conceded. Now tell me more about this investigation of yours. If you're pulling down the temple, I want to understand exactly which pillars you're targeting first. Across town, Martin Reynolds paced his penthouse office, a glass of scotch in hand, while Judge Montgomery sat rigidly in a leather chair, his own drink untouched. Nathan Goldstein, Reynolds's criminal defense attorney, was reviewing documents at the conference table. The subpoenas are too broad, Goldstein concluded, looking up from the papers. We can fight them, but it will only delay the inevitable. They're building a RICO case, Martin. The pattern is clear. Then we need to disrupt their case before it solidifies, Reynolds replied sharply. Starting with Washington. Every prosecutor has skeletons, Nathan. Find hers. Montgomery, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. She's been meeting with other judges, Peterson, Ramirez, Chen, the ones not involved in our arrangements, building alliances within the courthouse. What about the archives? Reynolds demanded. Has Coleman been contained? Temporarily, Montgomery replied. Barnes is dangling early release for her son, but she hasn't taken the bait yet. She's being careful, which suggests she knows we're watching her. Goldstein closed the file before him. You both need to understand something clearly. This has escalated beyond damage control. Federal prosecutors and the FBI are involved now. Your communications are likely already compromised. Meaning what exactly? Reynolds snapped. Meaning you need to start thinking about cooperation and damage limitation rather than counterattacks, Goldstein advised bluntly. The first ones to cooperate get the best deals. The suggestion of betrayal hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the already tense atmosphere. Montgomery stared at Reynolds, decades of conspiracy and mutual benefit suddenly overshadowed by self-preservation. No one is cooperating with anything, Reynolds declared, refilling his glass. There are still cards we haven't played. He turned to Montgomery, eyes cold with determination. It's time we address the Washington problem more directly. Goldstein stood abruptly. If you're suggesting what I think you are, I can't be part of that conversation. Relax, Nathan, Reynolds said with a dismissive wave. I'm talking about leveraging information, not anything dramatic. Go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start pushing back. After the attorney left, Reynolds locked the door and returned to Montgomery. Now let's discuss our actual options, without the ethical constraints of the Bar Association clouding the conversation. The judge drained his previously untouched drink in one swallow, his hand trembling slightly as he set down the glass. Whatever Reynolds was about to propose, Montgomery knew they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The following Monday morning, Imani arrived at the federal building to find a media circus on the steps. Reporters thrust microphones toward her as she attempted to navigate through the crowd, shouting questions about abuse of power, personal vendettas, and prosecutorial misconduct. Inside the lobby, her colleague Danielle Rodriguez was waiting, her expression grim. "You've seen the news?" Danielle asked, guiding Imani toward the elevators. "Just the reporters outside. What happened?" Danielle handed her a tablet displaying the front page of the city's leading newspaper. The headline blared, "Federal prosecutor accused of using position to advance personal lawsuit." The article quoted anonymous sources within the courthouse, claiming Imani had improperly leveraged her federal authority to intimidate a judge and local business owner over a private contract dispute. "It gets worse," Danielle said as they entered the elevator. The State Bar Association received an ethics complaint against you this morning. DA Barnes gave an interview suggesting your investigation is politically motivated. Karen Phillips was waiting in Imani's office, along with Thomas Okafor and 2 representatives from the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility. "Washington," Karen greeted her, tone professional but supportive. "These are Agents Kaplan and Chen from OPR. They need to take your statement regarding the ethics complaint." For the next 2 hours, Imani methodically walked the OPR agents through the case's evolution, from her initial civil suit to the discovery of judicial misconduct, her consultation with supervisors before pursuing the federal investigation, and the clear separation she had maintained between her personal case and the official corruption probe. "All my actions in the civil case were as a private citizen," she emphasized. "All my actions in the corruption investigation were properly authorized through this office with appropriate recusals where my personal interests intersected." Agent Kaplan reviewed her documentation with professional thoroughness. "You've maintained exemplary records of these separations, Ms. Washington. That will be helpful in addressing the complaint." "This isn't about ethics," Imani said frankly. "It's about intimidation. Reynolds and his judicial allies are attempting to discredit the investigation by attacking me personally." "Which suggests they're afraid of what you've uncovered," Agent Chen observed. After the OPR agents departed, Karen closed the office door. "OPR will clear you, but that's not their real play. They're trying to create enough noise to justify removing you from the case." "Not happening," Imani stated firmly. "Agreed," Karen replied. "But we need to adjust our strategy. Thomas will take the public lead on the corruption case. You'll continue directing the investigation but stay out of the spotlight temporarily, giving them the appearance of a win while we continue building the case," Thomas noted. Imani nodded reluctantly, recognizing the tactical necessity. "What about the grand jury?" "Proceeding as planned," Karen confirmed. Agent Reyes secured Judge Williams from the Eastern District to oversee it. No connections to our local judges. As they continued discussing strategy, Imani's phone buzzed with a text from the security detail assigned to her grandmother's house. "Vehicle circling block repeatedly. Black SUV, tinted windows, license plate obscured." She showed the message to her colleagues, concern evident in her expression. "I'll have the FBI increase surveillance," Karen said immediately. "They're escalating their intimidation tactics." "They're panicking," Thomas corrected, "which means we're on the right track." Later that afternoon, Imani received an unexpected call from William Prescott, Reynolds' civil attorney. His usual smooth confidence had given way to a strained formality. "Ms. Washington, I'm calling regarding your grandmother's case. My client has authorized me to offer a revised settlement." "I'm listening," Imani replied cautiously. "Full restoration of the staircase by master craftsmen using the original designs. Financial compensation of $500,000 for breach of contract and diminished value. A public apology from Reynolds Development, acknowledging their failure to honor the preservation requirements." The offer exceeded her original demands, raising immediate suspicion. "And in exchange?" Prescott hesitated briefly. "You would agree to drop your civil suit and make a public statement clarifying that your concerns have been fully addressed." "That's all?" Imani pressed, hearing the deliberate omission. Another pause. "My client would hope that resolution of this personal matter might refocus priorities regarding other investigations." "Mr. Prescott, are you suggesting that I use my position to influence a federal corruption investigation in exchange for a favorable civil settlement? Because that would constitute attempted bribery of a federal official." "Absolutely not." Prescott backpedaled quickly. "I'm merely conveying my client's settlement offer in the civil matter. Any broader implications are your interpretation, not my intent." "Then let me be clear. I'll discuss your settlement offer with my grandmother, as it pertains solely to our civil case. However, the federal investigation into judicial corruption is entirely separate and will proceed regardless of any civil resolution. After ending the call, Imani immediately documented the conversation and reported it to Karen Phillips. The settlement offer, coming amid their coordinated media attacks, suggested Reynolds was pursuing multiple strategies simultaneously, discrediting her publicly while attempting to resolve the triggering case privately. Across town, Michelle Coleman sat in a secured FBI safe house, reviewing courthouse records with Agent Reyes. Her son had been moved to a federal facility for his protection while the investigation proceeded, neutralizing Reynolds' leverage attempt. Judge Montgomery has scheduled an unusual number of case reassignments this week, Michelle noted, highlighting patterns in the docket, moving cases away from himself and the other implicated judges, trying to distance themselves from controversial rulings, Agent Reyes suggested, or preparing for potential recusals, Michelle countered. Notice which judges are receiving these cases. All newer appointments with no historical connections to Reynolds. Creating plausible deniability while preserving the outcomes, Reyes concluded. Clever, but it creates another paper trail for us to follow. Meanwhile, at the county courthouse, Carmen Martinez maintained her cover as Montgomery's loyal clerk while secretly documenting every unusual action. The judge had grown increasingly paranoid, checking his office for surveillance devices and speaking in coded language when discussing sensitive matters. Today, he had asked her to clear his calendar for an evening meeting at Reynolds' penthouse, a gathering of all 5 implicated judges. As soon as Montgomery left for a hearing, Carmen texted the information to her FBI contact. Within minutes, surveillance teams were being positioned around Reynolds' building, preparing to document who attended and how long they stayed. That evening, Imani visited her grandmother, finding Eleanor calmly reading in her living room, despite the unmarked security vehicles discreetly positioned on her street. Reynolds offered to settle, Imani explained, outlining the terms. It's more than we initially demanded. Eleanor marked her place in her book thoughtfully. And what does your prosecutor's instinct tell you about this sudden generosity? That they're trying to resolve the precipitating case to undermine the larger investigation. If we settle, they'll claim the corruption probe was always about leveraging my position for personal gain. Then the answer is clear, Eleanor replied. We don't settle, at least not yet. Not until the truth about their systematic destruction of our community's heritage is exposed. She studied her granddaughter's face. But that's not what's really troubling you, is it? Imani sighed, sinking into the armchair across from her grandmother. They're attacking me professionally, Nana. Ethics complaints, media smears, suggestions of misconduct, my reputation, everything I've worked for. Stop right there, Eleanor interrupted firmly. Your reputation was built on truth and integrity. Those can be challenged, but not destroyed unless you abandon them. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Your great-grandfather built that staircase when no white-owned company would hire him despite his master craftsmanship. Every curve and chisel mark was his statement that our history matters, that our artistry deserves preservation. Reynolds and these judges have been systematically erasing that history across this city for decades. She reached for Imani's hand. So let them attack. Let them smear. The truth doesn't fear investigation. As Imani drove home that night, she noticed a black SUV following at a discreet distance, the same vehicle that had been circling her grandmother's neighborhood. Instead of alarm, she felt a cold determination settle over her. She picked up her phone and called Agent Reyes. Diana, I'm being followed. Black SUV, tinted windows, matching the description from my grandmother's security detail. She recited the partial license plate she'd managed to glimpse. I'm not changing my route. Let's see where this leads. Surveillance teams are being deployed, Reyes responded. We'll identify the vehicle and occupants. Continue normally but stay on the line. 20 minutes later, After Imani had safely reached her apartment building with its federal security presence, Reyes called back. The SUV is registered to Executive Protection Services, a private security firm frequently employed by Reynolds Development. We've identified the occupants as former police officers now working private security. They've been instructed to maintain surveillance but not engage. They wanted me to know I was being watched, Imani concluded. Most likely. It's another intimidation tactic, Reyes agreed, but it gives us another connection between Reynolds and the pressure campaign against you. What neither of them realized was that at that very moment, in Reynolds' penthouse, the 5 judges were concluding their emergency meeting with a decision that would dramatically escalate the conflict. Judge Montgomery, looking pale and resolute, was the last to sign a document before him. "It's done," he said to Reynolds. "The administrative order is signed. Effective tomorrow morning, all federal prosecutors will be required to register with courthouse security and receive explicit judicial approval before accessing any county records or communicating with court personnel." Reynolds smiled thinly. "Let's see how Ms. Washington conducts her investigation when she can't set foot in the building without your permission." Judge Forrester, the most senior of the 5, looked uneasy. "This is a direct challenge to federal authority, Martin. It will escalate matters significantly." "That's precisely the point," Reynolds replied. "Sometimes the best defense is a forceful offense. Washington and her FBI friends think they have us cornered. Tomorrow they'll discover they've walked into a constitutional confrontation they weren't prepared for." As Reynolds refilled their glasses in celebration of their countermove, none of them noticed the catering staff member who had been methodically clearing dishes throughout their meeting, an FBI undercover agent who had just recorded every word of their conspiracy. The administrative order signed by the 5 judges detonated like a bomb in the legal community. By 9 a.m. Tuesday morning, U.S. Attorney Karen Phillips was in emergency meetings with the Department of Justice, while FBI agents attempting to access courthouse records were turned away by security guards citing the new protocol. News vans lined the streets surrounding both the county courthouse and federal building, their satellite trucks creating a media encampment that transformed the downtown plaza into an impromptu press briefing area. Judge Montgomery delivered a statement on the courthouse steps, his judicial robes lending gravitas to what amounted to a declaration of jurisdictional war. "This administrative order protects the independence of our county judiciary from federal overreach. While we respect our federal colleagues, their recent intrusion into county court operations without proper judicial authorization represents an unprecedented breach of comity between court systems." Thomas Okafor watched the statement from Imani's office, his expression darkening with each carefully crafted sentence. He's framing this as a principled stand about court independence rather than what it actually is, obstruction of a federal investigation. "It's clever," Imani acknowledged. "They're creating a procedural barrier while avoiding any mention of the underlying corruption probe. To the public, it looks like a technical dispute about protocol." Karen Phillips entered, closing the door firmly behind her. "The Chief Judge of the Federal District has issued an emergency injunction against the administrative order, citing interference with a federal criminal investigation. U.S. Marshals will enforce access for our investigators." Her expression remained grim. "But this escalates a legal dispute into a potential physical confrontation between federal and county officers." "Which is exactly what they want," Imani realized. "Create enough chaos and jurisdictional conflict to delay our investigation while they destroy evidence." "The timing isn't coincidental," Thomas added. "Our grand jury convenes tomorrow. They're trying to prevent key courthouse witnesses from testifying." The anticipated confrontation came at 11:30 a.m. when FBI agents accompanied by U.S. Marshals arrived at the courthouse archives. County security, reinforced by sheriff's deputies, blocked their entry. News cameras captured the standoff, federal and county law enforcement facing each other in the courthouse lobby, hands hovering near weapons, separated only by a marble information desk. Downtown businesses began closing early. The mayor called for calm. Social media exploded with partial information and wild speculation. Activists gathered on the courthouse steps, some supporting federal intervention, others protesting against it, their competing chants creating a discordant backdrop to the institutional power struggle unfolding inside. In a quiet corner office at the federal building, however, Imani was focused on a different approach entirely. "While they're creating a spectacle at the front door, we'll enter through the back," she explained to Agent Reyes and a small team of prosecutors and agents. "Reynolds and the judges think they've blocked our access to courthouse personnel and records. They've forgotten about the people who've been documenting their corruption all along." On her laptop screen, Carmen Martinez appeared via secure video link, her image deliberately obscured. "Judge Montgomery is in emergency meetings with the other implicated judges. The courthouse is in chaos. Most staff are watching the standoff in the lobby. Can you access the secured area of the archives without being observed?" Imani asked. Carmen nodded. "Michelle gave me her backup key card. Security is focused on the main entrances. The internal service corridors are unmonitored." "Perfect," Agent Reyes said. "Our team will meet you at the loading dock entrance in 30 minutes. You'll guide them to the archives through the service corridors." As they finalized details, Imani's phone rang, an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Washington." The voice was unfamiliar, male, professionally modulated. "I represent certain interests at Reynolds Development who feel matters have escalated unnecessarily." "Who is this?" Imani demanded. "My identity is less important than my message. There are documents being removed from the county archives as we speak, evidence critical to your investigation. Judge Montgomery ordered their destruction this morning." Imani signaled Agent Reyes, who immediately began tracing the call. "Why are you telling me this?" "Not everyone at Reynolds agrees with Martin's methods. Some of us believe his actions have become extreme. We're willing to cooperate in exchange for consideration." "I'm listening." "Check your email. You'll find building schematics for Reynolds' corporate headquarters, including the location of a private vault in his executive suite. Inside is a ledger, handwritten records of payments to judges and officials going back 15 years. Martin keeps it as insurance against betrayal." "Why should I believe you?" "Because in approximately 20 minutes, county maintenance workers will begin shredding 30 years of sealed court records from cases involving Reynolds companies. Records Michelle Coleman preserved despite destruction orders. You can verify my information or debate its credibility, but you don't have time for both." The call ended abruptly. Imani looked at Reyes, who shook her head. "Burner phone, untraceable. Could be a trap," Thomas warned. "Or an opportunity," Imani countered, checking her email. The promised schematics had arrived, along with security protocols for Reynolds' building. "Either way, we need to move now to secure those archives." Within minutes, they had split into two teams. One headed to the courthouse loading dock to meet Carmen and secure the threatened archives, the other obtaining an emergency warrant to search Reynolds' corporate headquarters based on the whistleblower's information. Imani joined the courthouse team, acutely aware that she was deliberately violating the administrative order barring her from the building. If they failed to find evidence of document destruction, she would be professionally exposed. If they succeeded, the violation would be justified. Carmen met them as planned, looking nervous but determined. "This way," she whispered, leading them through utilitarian corridors that service the courthouse's operational needs: HVAC systems, electrical panels, maintenance access points. These backstage passageways revealed the unglamorous infrastructure supporting the marble-faced temple of justice above. They reached the archives through a service entrance typically used for delivering new record boxes. Inside, they found exactly what the whistleblower had described: 3 maintenance workers methodically feeding documents into industrial shredders. Bankers' boxes labeled "sealed by judicial order" were stacked nearby, their contents awaiting destruction. "FBI, stop immediately," Agent Reyes commanded, her badge raised. The workers froze, clearly unprepared for federal agents appearing through the service entrance. One worker recovered quickly, reaching for his phone. "I need to call my supervisor." "That won't be necessary," Imani said, producing the federal injunction. "This court order prohibits destruction of any courthouse records. Step away from the shredders." As agents secured the workers and began documenting the scene, Imani examined the partially destroyed documents. They were court records from cases involving Reynolds companies, settlement agreements, sealed motions, financial disclosures that had been removed from public files. "They're destroying the paper trail," she murmured to Agent Reyes. "Electronic records can be altered, but these original documents show what actually happened in these cases." Carmen appeared at her side, her voice low. "There's more." Michelle maintained a separate archive of significant documents, duplicates she made before the originals were sealed or misplaced. It's hidden in a storage room that doesn't appear on official building plans. Meanwhile, the team at Reynolds corporate headquarters executed their search warrant with precision, bypassing the chaotic lobby confrontation by accessing the executive floor through a service elevator. Following the whistleblower's schematics, they located the concealed vault behind a bookcase in Reynolds's private office. Inside, exactly as described, was a leather-bound ledger containing handwritten records of payments, dates, case numbers, and judicial assignments, a meticulous accounting of corruption spanning 15 years. Martin Reynolds, like many arrogant criminals, had documented his own conspiracy, keeping records as leverage against potential betrayal by his co-conspirators. By mid-afternoon, the simultaneous operations had secured a treasure trove of evidence. The preserved archives Michelle had protected, the documents Reynolds had ordered destroyed, and his own damning ledger. The jurisdictional standoff in the courthouse lobby, which had occupied all media attention, had been merely a distraction from the real investigative breakthrough occurring through the back channels. As Imani supervised the cataloging of recovered documents, her phone buzzed with a text from the security detail at her grandmother's house. "Emergency. Respond immediately." Her blood ran cold. While they had been focused on securing evidence, Reynolds had apparently decided to strike directly at her most vulnerable point. "I need to go," she told Agent Reyes urgently. "Something's happened at my grandmother's house." "Take a tactical team," Reyes insisted. "This could be another trap." "No time," Imani replied, already moving toward the exit. "Secure the evidence. That's the priority." As she raced toward her grandmother's neighborhood, Imani's mind cycled through worst-case scenarios. Had Reynolds finally crossed the line from intimidation to actual violence? The constitutional crisis at the courthouse suddenly seemed distant and abstract compared to the very personal threat potentially unfolding at her family home. When she arrived, the street was blocked by emergency vehicles, police cruisers, an ambulance, and a fire truck, their lights painting the historic neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Imani abandoned her car and ran the final block, her heart pounding in her throat. The security agent met her at the police line, his face grim. "Ms. Washington, there's been an incident." "What happened? Is my grandmother—" Imani couldn't finish the question, fear constricting her throat. "Ms. Washington is unharmed," the agent assured her quickly. "But there was an attempted break-in. 2 men tried to access the house through the rear entrance approximately 40 minutes ago." Relief washed over Imani, followed immediately by renewed concern. "Where is she now?" "Inside. She insisted on remaining in her home despite our recommendation to relocate." The agent's expression suggested both frustration and reluctant admiration. "She's formidable." Imani hurried past the emergency vehicles to find Eleanor Washington seated calmly in her living room, providing a statement to a police detective. A shattered window had been covered with a temporary board, and evidence markers dotted the kitchen floor. "Nana!" Imani rushed to embrace her grandmother, who appeared remarkably composed given the circumstances. "I'm perfectly fine, child," Eleanor assured her, patting her hand. "Though I can't say the same for those foolish men who thought they could intimidate an old woman in her own home." The detective cleared his throat. "Ms. Washington, your grandmother was quite resourceful. When the intruders attempted to enter, she deployed a home security system that hadn't been disclosed to the protection detail." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. "Your grandfather's shotgun served its purpose. I didn't aim to hit them, just let them know they'd chosen the wrong house. The buckshot in the kitchen cabinets made quite an impression." "The noise alerted our agents," the security officer added, "who apprehended one suspect attempting to flee. The second escaped but was identified through security camera footage. Both are known associates of Executive Protection Services. Reynolds' security firm," Imani noted grimly. "The captured individual has already implicated Martin Reynolds," the detective confirmed. "Claims they were instructed to recover documents allegedly stolen from Reynolds' development and being stored at this residence." "There are no such documents here," Imani said. "Of course not," Eleanor agreed, "but it provided them with a pretext. Their actual purpose was clearly intimidation, or worse." The detective closed his notebook. "We've referred the case to the FBI, given its connection to an ongoing federal investigation. The suspect is being transported to federal custody now." After the police departed, Imani insisted on inspecting the entire house before settling with her grandmother in the kitchen, where the evidence of Eleanor's security system remained visible in the splintered cabinetry. "You could have been killed, Nana." Eleanor poured tea with steady hands. "I've faced worse than hired thugs in my lifetime, child. And it seems I've outlasted them once again." She handed Imani a cup. "Now tell me what happened at the courthouse today. The news is calling it a constitutional crisis." As Imani recounted the day's events, the administrative order, the standoff, and their successful evidence recovery, Eleanor listened attentively, her expression growing more satisfied with each detail. "So Reynolds and Montgomery overplayed their hand," she concluded. "Created a spectacle that allowed you to secure the very evidence they were desperately trying to destroy." "Yes," Imani confirmed. "And now we have Reynolds on conspiracy charges related to the break-in attempt here. The dominoes are falling." Her phone rang. Agent Reyes. "Washington, we've arrested Reynolds. The ledger contained detailed records of every payment, every case fixed, every judge compromised. He's offering to cooperate fully in exchange for consideration at sentencing." "Of course he is," Imani replied, unsurprised. "Reynolds always makes practical business decisions. Once the ledger was discovered, turning on his co-conspirators became his most profitable option." Judge Montgomery and the others were taken into custody an hour ago. The chief federal judge has appointed an interim administrative panel to oversee the county courts until this is resolved. After completing the call, Imani updated her grandmother on the latest developments. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, sipping her tea. "Justice moves in unexpected ways sometimes. Your civil case about a carved staircase has exposed decades of corruption and may transform the entire judicial system." "The staircase was just the beginning," Imani acknowledged. "Reynolds' targeting of historically significant properties in minority neighborhoods was part of a larger pattern of erasing cultural heritage for profit." The following week unfolded with the methodical precision of a well-orchestrated legal symphony. The grand jury, presented with the mountain of evidence secured from the archives and Reynolds' ledger, returned indictments against all 5 judges, D.A. Barnes, Martin Reynolds, and 12 other officials implicated in the corruption scheme. Reynolds, true to form, had quickly negotiated a cooperation agreement, providing detailed testimony about the decades-long conspiracy. In exchange for reduced charges, He revealed how the operation had evolved from occasional favorable rulings in the 1990s to a sophisticated system of case steering, predetermined outcomes, and strategic targeting of historically significant properties for development. Judge Montgomery, facing the most severe charges due to his central role, maintained his innocence until confronted with the ledger entries in his own handwriting. His subsequent confession implicated several other judges not previously identified, expanding the investigation's scope further. The corruption probe sent shockwaves through the legal community, prompting reviews of judicial conduct across the state. 3 federal judges who had risen through the county court system requested recusal from all pending cases until their connections to Montgomery could be thoroughly examined. As the criminal cases progressed, Imani returned her focus to her grandmother's civil suit against Reynolds Development. With Reynolds himself now a cooperating federal witness, his company eager to demonstrate good faith, and the corrupt judicial obstacles removed, the path to resolution had cleared significantly. 2 months after the dramatic courthouse confrontation, Imani and Eleanor met with Reynolds Development's new management team and their attorneys in the federal courthouse. The settlement they reached went far beyond the original demands: full restoration of the Washington home's historic staircase by master craftsmen, financial compensation of $2 million, establishment of a $50 million heritage preservation fund to restore other historically significant properties damaged by Reynolds projects, and a public acknowledgement of the company's role in systematically targeting and devaluing culturally important sites in minority neighborhoods. Most significantly, the settlement included creation of an independent oversight committee to review all future development projects involving designated historical properties, with community representatives holding veto power over proposed alterations. 6 months later, Eleanor Washington stood in her foyer, admiring the newly completed staircase. Master woodworkers had painstakingly recreated her grandfather's original design, following the few photographs and sketches that remained. Though new, the carved banister captured the spirit of the original, each curve and chisel mark telling the story of Black craftsmanship and resilience. "What do you think, Nana?" Imani asked, watching her grandmother's face. Eleanor ran her hand along the smooth wood, feeling the legacy of her family beneath her fingers. "I think your great-grandfather would be proud, not just of this staircase, but of what you accomplished because of it." That evening, community leaders gathered at the Washington home to celebrate more than just the restored staircase. The Heritage Preservation Fund had already identified 27 historically significant properties for restoration, with priority given to those that represented the cultural contributions of marginalized communities. Former Judge Montgomery's sentencing hearing had concluded with a 30-year federal prison term, sending a powerful message about judicial accountability. As twilight settled over the gathering, Imani found herself on the porch with Michelle Coleman, Robert Jackson, and Carmen Martinez, the courthouse witnesses whose years of quiet documentation had made the case possible. "I never thought I'd see this day," Michelle admitted, watching through the window as her son, now released under the review of non-violent drug convictions, chatted with other guests. "We documented the corruption for so long without anyone listening." "Sometimes justice needs persistence more than power," Imani replied. "You kept the truth alive until the moment was right." Inside, Eleanor was giving impromptu tours of the restored staircase, explaining its historical significance to attentive listeners. "This isn't just about wood and craftsmanship," she told them. "It's about who gets to preserve their history and who doesn't, whose heritage is deemed valuable and whose is disposable." Robert Jackson nodded toward the scene. "Your grandmother understands what was really at stake all along." "She always did," Imani agreed. "This case was never just about a contract dispute or even judicial corruption. It was about the systematic erasure of cultural heritage and the use of legal systems to facilitate that erasure." As darkness fell, the historic homes of Riverside glowed with warm light, their architectural features preserved rather than destroyed, their stories intact rather than replaced. The neighborhood stood as a testament to resilience, not just of buildings, but of the people who refused to let their heritage be discounted or demolished. In her grandmother's restored foyer, Imani ran her hand along the newly carved banister, feeling the connection between past and future. What had begun as a legal battle over a staircase had transformed into something far more significant: a reclamation of history, an affirmation of worth, and a powerful reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, would not be permanently denied.